You're listening to the Classic Gamers Guild podcast.
Hello and welcome to the Classic Gamers Guild podcast. I'm here tonight with Rick and Paul. Hey guys, how's it going?
I'm doing all right, thank you, all things considering.
I'm doing absolutely lovely, thanks for asking, dear.
Excellent. So I'd like to introduce a guest that actually needs no introduction, but I'm going to provide one anyways. Our guest has been making games since about 1982 and has been a part of my life personally since 1984. Teaching me to be entrepreneurial with Donald Duck, and later teaching me how to spell prophylactic with Leisure Suit Larry. As my education continued, I learned to problem solve, gamble in Larry's Casino, and eventually even mix pharmaceuticals with Freddy Farkas. Not to mention the plethora of other games he has been involved with that so many of us enjoy. I'd like to introduce to you all today, Al Lowe.
Well, thank you. That's a very nice introduction. You could have just typed rubber.
Yeah. Oh, geez. Well, now you tell me. Now you're going to tell me there's a way to bypass the questions at the beginning of the game, too.
Yeah, that's Alt-X.
Darn it.
Oh my god, I could have been playing it this entire time.
I thought the bypass was just Google.
Depends on when you started playing. When I was about 9 years old, the bypass was, "Hey, Dad," which luckily he was the kind of dad that accommodated.
Why are you asking me questions about Spiro Agnew?
So, yeah, it's great to have you on. I'm really excited. Now, maybe most of you probably don't know, but the Classic Gamers Guild has actually had the opportunity to meet with Al Lowe the few times in Seattle, going to PAX and maybe partying it up a little bit, telling stories. And this year, we're going to keep it a bit more low-key. The Classic Gamers Guild is going to hang out with you in a virtual format, which I think everybody will be excited about because they get to participate in our conversations.
That's great. I'm looking forward to it.
So, where did you grow up anyways? I've heard a lot about the games, but I haven't heard a lot about you. Did you have siblings? Did you have a big family, a small family?
I was born and raised in Gumbo, Missouri. At the time, it was a small community, maybe 200 people, and is now the site of a large airport just outside of St. Louis, Missouri. So I was mostly a country boy who was always interested in geeky stuff. I was a proto-nerd, I guess, back before the term was out. But I was the kid in grade school who jumped up to fix the film projector. I was the kid who resoldered the microphone cables and set up this. I built speaker systems and all that stuff. Back in those old days. So I was always interested in electronics and gadgets and things. And when computers first came out, I remember thinking that I just had to have one of these. I didn't know why or what I'd do with it, but it just seemed like the future, and I wanted to be a part of it. I was raised an only child. I had an older sister who was 13 years older, but by the time I was in grade school, she was grown and married. So I was essentially an only child with older parents. I was born when my father and mother were 45 years old. So I was an afterthought in their lives. So I had a lot of advantages. They were not financially well off, but they were certainly established. They had their life together. And so I enjoyed, I think, a great upbringing. I was very happy. And my older sister was always close with me. And the first part of my life, she was the built-in babysitter, She was the kind of surrogate mother. And then we remained close over the years. So that's my family story. I decided to because of all these different interests that I had, I was active in high school in a lot of different things, but music has always been a strong part of my life, and I lived in an area that had access to a lot of music, and my parents were very supportive in that they would take me to, before I could drive, of course, they would take me to band rehearsals and to practices and gigs, eventually to gigs. I started playing professionally when I was 13 and never had a high school job or a college job to speak of, always made my money playing music. And back then, it was an odd time. You could actually make a living as a musician, as opposed to now, where everybody just downloads whatever they want. So that's my childhood story.
I like that. And so you went to school, and when you were going to school, you went specifically to become a teacher. Did you think you would have ever been anything else? I think you worked with band, but did you know you'd be a teacher?
Oh, yeah. I went to college with the intent to be involved in music. And I quickly learned in my freshman year that musicians mostly starved, and it was far better to have a safe career to fall back on. So I quickly switched to a teaching major and got my bachelor's degree, and then within a year got my master's degree in music education. So always with the goal of becoming a high school band director, orchestra director, and eventually jazz band, marching band, and so forth.
I've heard a little bit about how you created a program before you even had your own home computer to do work with marching band formations. Could you maybe tell me a little bit about that?
Well, it wasn't with marching band formations. That was one I wanted to be able to create, but I couldn't. I didn't. I was unable to. It required too much graphics processing power and too much. So, but what I did create, I was working in the field as a music coordinator, and so I created a lot of music festivals. We had a marching band festival and a concert band festival and a jazz festival, and my wife had choir festivals and chorus competitions, and we made all of them competitive so that the choirs would get ranked from best to worst. They would get scores by several judges, and the scores would be added and averaged, and it was the perfect math job for a computer. So I went to the local school district that employed me, and I said to the computer guy, "Hey, this would be a perfect job for a computer." And he laughed at me and said, "Yeah, we'll get to that in about 20 years." So something happened, and he said, "We've got a basic programming manual, and no real man would ever use basic." He didn't say it that way, but that was what he meant. And you can have this manual, and we'll give you an account number and a password. And if you want, you can write your own program. And it was like, oh, yeah, I'll do that because I know everything about programming. I had no idea. So my son went to nursery school that fall and came home, and 2 weeks later had chicken pox. And 2 weeks after that, I had chicken pox. And I was sick as a dog, man. It was terrible. I called up the doctor's office and I said, "This is crazy. I had chicken pox when I was a kid." And the nurse said, "I've had it 3 times. You can have it more than once if you got chicken pox. So stay home and stay away from everybody for 2 weeks." Okay. So I was quarantined, and now you got to remember, this is in the early 80s, and we had 3, maybe 4 channels on the television, none of which was any good during the day. And we had books in the house, but I'd read them all. We had magazines, but I'd read them all. And, by the end of the first couple days, I was stir crazy. And so there was that big old manual from the basic programming manual that the computer guy had given me. And, well, hell, I'll just read this. And I started reading it, and it all made sense. It was DEC Basic from the, digital equipment company. And it made good sense. And the more I thought about it, the more I thought, well, I've designed the judging score forms for this contest. I know exactly what input is going to be, and I know exactly what the output's going to be. What if I just sat down and kind of had the computer do the math for me? And it was the perfect way to learn to program because I had a absolutely defined input, and I knew exactly, a defined output, and all I had to do was the processing in between. So by the end of the week, I thought I could do this. And my wife brought home a remote terminal. Picture this back in the old days, big old curved top ADM and an acoustic coupler modem that had two rubber suction cups, and you dialed your phone and then stuck the receiver into those rubber suction cups, and you could talk to the mainframe at a startling 110 baud.
Whoa.
Yeah, that's like 10 characters a second. I could type as fast as this damn modem went, but it gave me access to the mainframe, and I started for a week. I was, with the chickenpox, I was very sick, but by the second week, I was just bored. I'd recovered, but I was still contagious. I was under quarantine, and so I had a week of nothing to do except play with this new toy. And by the end of that week, I had entered most of the formulas needed for the program, and after that, it was just kind of refining it and making it simpler. So in the fall of 1978, we were the first music festival anywhere to use computerized scoring. And I was very pleased when we got to the actual day of the event, and it actually worked. That was always a pleasant surprise.
It sounds like we possibly wouldn't have Larry and some of your beloved characters without the chickenpox. So I'm sorry to say, but I'm glad you got that.
I am too, and it also got me this beard. If you've ever seen a picture of me, I've had a beard ever since that day, which was when my son, contaminated me, infected me. But it was, I've had a beard for over 4 years now because I had chickenpox so bad that I couldn't shave. It was just, you couldn't put your finger anywhere on my body that wasn't a pox. It was nasty, man. So I don't recommend it to anybody. Get your vaccines, you fools. Everybody, go get a vaccine if you don't have one. So.
We don't recommend it unless you want to become a successful game designer, in which case you may want to seek out. So I'm kind of fascinated with your background in music, and I noticed that with most of your games, I believe Sans Freddy, that you composed on them, and I was just curious, was that something like a requirement of yours? Did you want to be the composer on your games, or was that more of just, extra stress to deal with?
At the time, a programmer was responsible for all aspects of a title. And when I first started, I did graphics as well. I did everything. And it wasn't until later that teams developed. Obviously, most programmers weren't very good at drawing, and so graphics were the first thing they went over. But also music was a real afterthought back then, and there were no full-time game composers by far or anything else. So because I had a background in music, it was easy for me to write some little ditties. I mean, you got to remember, the best synthesizer available to us had 3 voices and a noise channel. So, a noise channel being like a snare drum or cymbals or something like that. So you couldn't really do very much. It didn't take a lot to be a composer in those days. It wasn't until MIDI came along that music became a thing in computer games, and that was 86, 87, something like that. Mm-hmm. You have to remember that we're talking about a very primitive time.
Right.
The early games, the first 5 years or maybe more, that I wrote games, there was no Photoshop.
Right.
The time before Photoshop.
we created games before there was a Photoshop. And you tell that to people now, and they go, whoa, how do you do that? What? You can't do that. All those adventure games that Sierra did, they all looked a lot alike because we only had the tools that Sierra created in order to make them. Sierra created a graphics editor so that we could create the backgrounds. They created an animation program so we could animate characters. They created a sound effects program and a music program and a font editor. We had to create our own fonts. I remember there was a scene where I wanted a larger font in Larry 2, I think it was, and they didn't have a larger font. And so I said to somebody, can I use the font editor? Yeah. And so I made a big bold font like I don't know, Helvetica or something. And I had to make it myself. I had to click pixels until I got letter shapes. And I don't think I made lowercase. I think I only made an uppercase alphabet. But it was a primitive time.
Yeah, that's incredible. Like, where's the drop-down menu where I can just select 14 or 16 and change my size? So, being the resident musician, if you will, at Sierra at the time, were you called upon by your peers to come up with little ditties for their games?
Sure. Yeah. At the when they found out that I had music skills, people called on me. I did the music for Space Quest 2 and King's Quest 2. And what else? A few other. Until I got more active in designing myself, and games got bigger. Suddenly, I didn't have the time to do those things. But in fact, I was lead programmer on King's Quest 3, and they asked me to do the music, and I said, "Oh, I can't do that," and also, get this program out by Christmas, which is everybody's goal. So they hired my wife to create the music for King's Quest 3. So if you look, you can see Margaret Lowe's music credits, and she did a good job. The music, I like the music she did. Yeah. So.
It's great. King's Quest 3 is near and dear to many people's hearts. I think because it invoked a lot of emotion. I mean, fear and wonder and mystery. There was a lot going on in that game.
Fear of typing. I argued with Roberta about accepting typos in those spells. And she said, "Nope. If there's any typo, it's wrong, and they die." It's like, oh man, you cut people some slack. But nope, she didn't. She stuck with it. So
I appreciate it. As a kid who wasn't really good at school in general, I was always really good at English and spelling, and my teachers would always ask me, and I'd always say, "Oh, I have a little bit of help at home." Like I die if I spell things wrong. That's help. How in the world did you guys end up making Disney games in the 1980s? And I mean, not what I would expect. I was never really a Disney kid, but a game like Donald Duck's Playground, it was almost like an adventure game. You were creating an entrepreneurial environment, and you were going to the store, buying things, making your own change to upgrade a playground at home. I mean, that was a pretty broad concept for a kid's game, especially Disney.
Yeah, what the hell was I thinking? Well, let's see. I'll take the first part of your question first. How did we get the rights to the Disney characters? The day that I met Ken Williams was at Apple Fest of 1982. I think it was 81 maybe. And that was the day that Texas Instruments quit the business. Now, how's this? This is a weird start to this story, but Texas Instruments thought, well, we make computer chips, therefore we should make a computer. And this Apple thing is selling, and what Atari was selling. We'll make a Texas Instruments, and we'll call it the TI-99. And the secret to success is to spend as much money as possible on celebrity endorsements and licensed properties. So this is true. So Texas Instruments. I'm sure there's a Wikipedia article on this. Texas Instruments went out and hired Bill Cosby to be their spokesman. Now he was a huge success at this time, unlike today, but he was a really big deal, and I'm sure they spent millions. He was their spokesman, and they hired. They bought the rights to Barbie. To all the Mattel games. They bought the rights to the Disney characters. They bought, I don't know, just a lot more, a whole lot of things, thinking that was the way that their games would succeed. And by the way, anything that worked on our machine would not run on anybody else's machine. So when you got a TI-99, boy, you were the only person that had these games. Well, people didn't really like that. People liked freedom of choice and open architecture and all those things that turned out to be true. Well, they didn't see it that way. So quickly, within years, just a couple of years, Texas Instruments said, "Ooh, we're losing millions and millions of dollars. Let's quit." And they said, let's get rid of it. And so when Ken Williams heard this, he knew somebody at Texas Instruments, and he called him up and he said, "You guys own all these rights. What are you going to do with all the Disney the rights to the Disney characters?" And they said, "I don't know. Well, I guess lose money." And he said, "Well, what if I gave you a little bit of money and you would be out from underneath the contract?" And they agreed. So Sierra ended up with the rights to all Disney characters in all home computer software for a song. I mean, it was dirt cheap. He didn't pay much money at all. Fire sale. So we ended up. He said to me, "Well, go home and come up with 50 ideas for games." And bring them back to me next week. And so I think I ended up with 20. Anyway, we looked at all these characters, and Roberta said, "Well, I'll do an adventure game where you go to space, and we'll send Mickey Mouse traveling between planets, and you'll learn all kind of stuff about different planets." Okay. And they said to me, "Do you want to do Winnie the Pooh?" And I said, "Oh, yeah, I love Winnie the Pooh." So I bought all the Winnie Pooh books, A.A. Milne's books, and read them all, and I had a wonderful time creating the Winnie the Pooh in the 100 Acre Woods title. And somebody else did another title. I'm trying to remember what the other one was. There was a Goofy game as well, and Goofy's Wordplay or something, and several other games. Anyway, from those titles, we ended up being pretty successful, and they liked the Winnie the Pooh game, and at that time Disney was coming out with a big motion picture feature film, a movie for adults called The Black Cauldron. That's my dog. And the Black Cauldron, they said, "Well, we liked what you did with Winnie the Pooh. Would you do a Black Cauldron game?" And I said, "Sure." So they flew me down to Hollywood and got me a limo that had a car phone. I had never seen a car phone. And they drove me to the studios and took me down into the Disney archives, which sounds so impressive. Now, I had been to the National Archives in Washington, D.C., on the Mall, or Pennsylvania Avenue, and giant marble columns out front and a giant marble building. And so when they said, "Well, you're going to go to the Disney Ark," I was picturing something along the lines of a somber bank building and so forth. But instead, they took me to a 2-story office building that kind of looked like a motel of the 50s. And they said, "Walk down this external staircase that went down into the basement." So I went down into this, basement stairwell, and rang the bell, and this woman came to the door, and she said, "Oh, yeah, you're Allo. Okay, come on inside." Oh, and the phone started ringing. She said, "Well, I'm here all alone. Just wait right here, and I'll be right back." And I said, "Let me answer the phone. I got so So I'm standing in the doorway of this basement hall and waiting, and I kind of leaned and put my hand up on the wall, and there was the original pencil drawings to Snow White.
Whoa.
And they had hundreds and thousands of original cells from the films. So she took me to a back room, and there was a table that must have been 8 feet square. I had to be 8 feet on a side, so square table, and it was rounded over with a mountain of boards, poster boards that had original watercolor drawings on them. So just imagine a mound of original artwork. Yeah. And I said, "What's this?" And she said, "Oh, these are all the backgrounds from the Black Cauldron." And I said, "Oh my God, so you have to categorize all these and file them and everything?" She said, "Oh no, we'll pull out a few and keep them, and the rest we'll trash."
Ooh. Ouch.
And she said, I'm dreading next week. I said, "Why is that?" And she said, "Well, I get 280,000 cells celluloid at the end, and I have to pick the 1% that we save, and then we'll throw away all the rest." This is the days before Michael Eisner, obviously, who realized, oh my God, this is a profit center we could be selling. So that was my experience with the Disney company. They gave me a bunch of original drawings from the Black Cauldron, and I said I need to have the music. We want to put music in the game, and they said, "Oh well, come over here to this shelf," and here was this steel shelf that there were folders numbered 1 to 25, and the first one was Steamboat Willie, and Steamboat Mickey, and all the way down to the Black Cauldron. All the original scores in the original handwriting of the composers of those films, and they let me make Xerox copies of the scores, and I didn't save it. I guess I gave it back to them. I should have saved a copy, but anyway, I guess that had been a violation of something. But so anyway, that's how they ended up with it. Now the bigger question is, why did we get rid of it? Mm-hmm. At that point in computer games, licensed properties didn't sell well. Because I think so many of the characters, like the Barbie games and the different titles came out, and they weren't very good, and so people just said, "Yeah, we'll just go with the original creators, the King's Quests and the I don't know, other games that people created originally." And so after a couple of years of selling Disney titles, Ken said, "We're doing all the work and Disney's getting all the profit. Why don't we just make our own games and give this back?" So he gave the rights back to Disney and didn't renew the contract. And so that's how the Disney characters came and went in the Sierra catalog.
That's fascinating.
Donald Duck's Playground, back to that just for a moment. I mean, it was kind of like my first introduction into adventure-style games, being able to walk three-dimensionally, at least to me, around on the screen. Was that an idea that you guys had come up with during the making of the Disney games?
Well, yeah. The King's Quest came out during the time during the Disney period at Sierra. And so once we had the AGI interpreter and engine, I guess you'd call it, then it seemed logical to use that in other titles. And so while Winnie the Pooh was written, I think, on an Apple II, and then I translated to Commodore and Atari and so forth. In a year or two, when King's Quest came out, we had this more advanced language, and so we used that AGI language to create Black Cauldron, and then from Black Cauldron, when they wanted a Donald Duck game, I said, "Well, we can do this 3D stuff," and I knew how to do it then because I had to learn on Black Cauldron. There were, I don't know if people understand how primitive this stuff was, but AGI as a language AGI stands for Adventure Game Interpreter, and it was literally written to be that. It was a program that would interpret intermediate code called pseudocode, P code. It would interpret that P code and play a game back, no matter what game it was. So the idea was, rather than write a specific game with specific code, we would write this thing that could read game code and play it back. So you wouldn't have to recreate everything every time. You could instead make a compiler that wrote the P code and then have the interpreter read the P code and play the game. So that's how that whole system game engine worked. But remember, we had to create our own graphics background editor and animation editor and all that stuff. So why was that Donald Duck that way? Well, I guarantee you it wasn't because of input from the Disney Corporation.
Yeah, that's for sure.
When this deal came about with home computers, nobody at Disney had any inkling of what the hell we were talking about. And so they had a educational division, an office with some women who had been elementary school teachers, and they were responsible for film strips and workbooks and stuff like that, educational movies, that part of Disney. And they said, well, I guess these home computers are kind of like a film strip. You girls take care of it. so these poor people, I mean, they had no interest. They had no home computers. They had never seen a computer. They didn't know what to do. So they pretty much said, oh, okay, whatever you want to do. And then they would come up with suggestions like, oh, I think his coat could be a little darker brown. And it's like, well, that's not how it works. Apple's got this color and it doesn't have any of the others, so it's not going to be a little different. It's going to be this or yellow. I had
it in amber monochrome. Beautiful.
Well, and that people forget about those days, but my God, the just watching it in black and white or green screen, I remember getting an amber monitor was a step up. I had a green screen. Mm-hmm. It was just a bunch of green dots, man. It was, So anyway, it was a different time. So why was Donald Duck's Playground the way it was? Because I'm interested in model railroads. And so there's a railroad switching puzzle in that game. And I lived in Fresno, and we flew out of the Fresno airport a lot. And so we were constantly getting our baggage tags confused with other places. And so there was a baggage sorting game. and Fresno is in the heart of the agricultural fruit and growing region, and so there was a agricultural melon products game.
I was so good at that one.
yeah, that was the best.
And you got to understand, I was working in a language that was geared to be for adventure titles. It was written specifically to create King's Quest. And games like that where you move around. So it wasn't really set up as an arcade game. For example, I wanted you to be able to earn money and spend money. And I had to have a way to display money. So this is how primitive the language was. I asked the guy who was in charge of the language at Sierra, would you please give me a print handling statement where I could say, there's 6,000 cents in this guy's account. I have a variable for 6,000. Can you print that on the screen as so many dollars and cents? And he said no. He said just use if statements. So I had to store how many cents you had and how many tens and how many dollars and how many tens of dollars, all in separate variables because he wouldn't give me 2-digit numbers. I could only go up to 255, and I knew you'd be able to, at some point make more. So I ended up writing a print statement that said at the top of the screen, if he has $1, print a 1. If he has $2, print a 2. Just the stupidest, literally dumbest form of programming possible. 10 nested if statements. And that was for each digit of the number. And then when he saw the game finished and saw what I was doing, he said, well, why didn't you tell me? I could have it would have taken me 5 minutes to make up. You son of a bitch.
Oh, that's great. Because, it was different. I never was big on the educational games. That and Tapper and the Ancient Art of War and Karateka, that was kind of all of my lead-ups into King's Quest IV, which I believe you had a bit of a hand in yourself.
I was the cavalry in King's Quest IV. If you look at the opening credits of that game, there it says programmed by 2 guys, and then it says cavalry coding by, and it lists about 17 other people. and that was our way of acknowledging what happened on that project. Sierra was busily wanting to go public. Their goal was to go public in the fall of '87, whatever year King's Quest IV came out. They wanted to go public, and they promised all the when you go public, you go around the country to various investors and offices and things and presented what's called a dog and pony show, where you tell people, hey, we got this new company and it's in this new market that nobody's ever heard of, and none of you know how to use computers and stuff, but it's a big thing with your kids. Your kids will like it. And we've got this new product coming out that's going to revolutionize the business, and it'll deal in higher resolution graphics, and it'll be able to eventually run CD-ROMs, which nobody ever heard of, and it'll have more colors and more animation and more memory and blah blah blah. Okay, and it's going to be the greatest thing going. And so the management was worried about all the aspects of going public. Nobody was worried about the game itself. Roberta had designed it, and she would go and look at the guys who programmed it and talk with them. And do you have any questions? No, everything's going great. Well, how come I can't see this? Well, that's coming, or we haven't got that done yet, or blah, blah. And so the 2 guys gave her lots of stories until finally, in August, she said, I don't think this game's going to make it. Can you have somebody take a look at it? So they called me up and they said, would you go look at this game and give us your honest assessment of whether it's going to be able to ship in a month? And I looked at it and I said, this game's not going to ship in a year. These 2 guys are totally lost. They have no idea what they're doing. And they're not willing to admit that they don't know and ask questions and ask for help. So Ken called a meeting of the company I was on Labor Day, I remember vividly, early September, and all the programmers in the company got together. Oh, and all the artists, come to think of it. I think they got everybody in the conference room and said, this game's got to ship by the end of the month. September 30th is the deadline, and we're going to close all other projects, and everybody in the company is going to work on King's Quest IV. And Al, you're in charge. And so it was like, holy cow. So we brought in, I think it was 15 programmers, something like that.
Wow.
And all the artists that, you have to remember, we had so few artists because nobody knew how to use the tools. I mean, it was one thing to say nobody knew how to draw on a computer, because nobody knew that. That just didn't happen. And there was no Photoshop. There was no drawing programs. There was one kid out of 100 that might have touched a mouse. It's just, it's crazy to, there were people that knew how to draw, but they didn't know how to use the programs that we had written to make stuff. So it was a real tough time. Everybody pitched in, and we had daily meetings, and I would assign this scene to this person and this scene to this person, and everybody had a small little piece of it, and my job was to make sure it all fit together and worked at one time. And our basic plan was that everyone would work around the clock, 24 hours a day, until you dropped over and fell over, and then you would go sleep at this motel that was next door. And we had rooms rented continuously, but we had a deal with them that they would change the sheets. So when a guy would go to bed at 4 a.m, he would sleep until 2 p.m. or something. They'd change the sheets, and somebody else would fall down and sleep from 3 p.m. until 10. And they'd change the sheets, and somebody'd come in at 10 and sleep. It was just, we literally shared bunks around the clock. And it rolled into a pattern of we would program all day and night, and then about 5 a.m. or 4 a.m, we would do a build of the game and then make copies of that. And then by 5 a.m., the QA staff would come in and they would start testing. And then they would list up, hundreds of bugs on paper, by the way, because nobody had bug testing software. There was no, any kind of bug management system. No, we didn't have. No, you just write up a piece of paper. So I would come in and I would sleep until 10 a.m. or something. I'd come in at 10 and we'd have a meeting, and I would go through and we found these bugs, this bug, and this. I'd throw all these papers at every programmer, and then they would work all day and night to fix those bugs and then finish the next scene that they were supposed to do.
Wow.
It was an amazing time, and we didn't make it. We shipped on September 31st.
Oh,
Because Sierra had a deal with, I think Software, etc., or one of the big software chains, that the game would ship in September. And we got down to the wire, and I said to the manager, the manufacturing manager, we're not going to make it. We just can't get it done today. And he said, I'll take care of it for you. And so we got, he got a few thousand boxes made to satisfy this contract, and he dated it September 31st. And that's the honest to God's truth.
wow.
So he got it into the store. And yeah, it was buggy as hell, but at least we got it done, and then we fixed bugs for a week after that, and then for another 2 weeks or so, there was still a team cleaning things up and repairing obscure kind of problems and stuff. But it was a hell of a project.
Goodness.
Cavalry coding.
So speaking of calling in the cavalry or saving the day, could you tell us a little bit about your role in Police Quest 1?
Well, Police Quest 1 was started long before Leisure Suit Larry 1. And they had one programmer and Jim Walls and an artist. And they worked for a year. And in the meantime, I had written Larry and shipped it, and realized it wasn't going to make me any money because it was a terrible seller. Didn't sell well at all the first month. And so they said, well, the King's Quest guys need help. Can you help them? So I moved into a house in Oakhurst with... and we literally lived together, Jim Walls and Greg Rowland and I, and we just worked round the clock that summer and fall, and got Police Quest 1 to ship in time for Christmas. I was very proud of that. But Police Quest was in pretty rough shape when I got to it. Jim was a storyteller. He was a policeman, highway, what do you call it? California Highway Patrol. Chips. Remember Chips? He was a California Highway Patrolman. And his writing style was kind of police reports. So if you've ever read a police report, that was his style of writing. And had never played a game. He thought that writing a game meant you wrote a story. So that's what he did. He wrote a story, and Greg programmed it. And when I got to the project, you could go into a scene, and if you knew exactly what you were looking for, you could type that in, and it would say, you got that thing, or whatever it is, and then you would go out and do it. But there were no clues. There was no auxiliary material. And I say, well, Jim, how is anybody supposed to know that you're supposed to walk around the car before you get into it? And he said, well, that's just standard police training. Yes, but... So my job, besides, some of the programming stuff, consisted of fleshing out the game so that there was more than one path that you could walk through it. It in essence, when I got to it, if you knew everything that was in Jim Wall's head, you could get through the game and play it. But if you made one mistake, it would kill you, and you had no idea why. His error messages throughout the game, it was always the same. You're blowing it. It was like, Jim, that's not really helpful at this point. How? So we went through a lot of, you could say this and that, and then we would program that stuff. So yeah, but oh my God, we had a great time. Jim was a wonderful storyteller and a great personality and fun to be with, and we laughed a lot during the development. It's not a funny game, but we laughed a lot at it. But driving those cars, that was so unforgiving. And I kept telling, I said, well, why don't you make it easier? Why don't you make it so that, if you press the up arrow and you can make a turn at the next junction. Nope, if you press the right arrow 1 pixel too early, you crash. And it was like, oh, shit, this isn't fun. But anyway, that was... so later on in some game, Larry 3, I think, I had a scene at the end of the game where you came down, you went in backstage at Sierra, and they were working on Police Quest. And that was my homage to Jim Walls working with him on that project.
I want to hear a little bit more about Leisure Suit Larry 3 and the Bamboo Forest. I know you had a little bit of fun with that, and I'd like to hear about it.
I was on an airplane flying to Germany to publicize Larry 2, which is kind of odd because Sierra never did any sales or marketing or spent any money advertising my games. It was all word of mouth. But they did have people in Europe who had money, and they said, well, we'll fly him over and let him do interviews with magazines and so forth and newspapers, and we'll get publicity that way. And so I said, wow, that sounds great. So I did a lot of touring to promote the games, but they didn't do a lot of spending of money for that kind of stuff. I was on an airplane, and I thought, how could I do a maze in a game? We had just recently gotten the ability to reverse animations on the fly, so that we could put up a static scene and flip it. I think both left and right and up and down, which, it was a simple matter of literally reading through the data backwards. I'm sure that's how he did it. He being the Jeff Stevenson, the lead programmer on the engine. But anyway, he did a thing where you could reverse an image, and I thought, boy, it would be fun to do a maze that didn't have to load from the disk. It would be all resonant, because one of the bugaboos back then was loading files from the floppy disk. It just took forever. And so if you were in a maze and you wanted to go from one scene to the next, oh God, it would have to load that whole image off the disk and load this, and it took forever. And so I thought, what if I just kept the image in memory and flipped it internally, and then had I had two paths that crossed, one that went east to west and one that went north to south. And then I had the artist draw up extra bamboo in the forest to block those 4 exits. So then I had I created a grid of, I think it was 64. I think it was 8 by 8. I'm not sure. It's been a long time, but I think it was a chessboard, a chessboard, 8 by 8, and I assigned a path through there. But all 64 of those scenes were the same image, except I would block 1 or 2 or maybe 3 of the openings in that path, so it looked like you couldn't go that way. And so then I thought, well, how could I store this most efficiently? I can't use the engine to do it because it'll try and load a fresh scene every time. How can I do it myself? And so I got 64 bits, which would be 8 bytes, right? Yeah. I got 8 bytes of memory, and assigned those to the 1 bit to each square on the checkerboard. And that I had a north, south, east, and west, and then I had another one for the direction of the image, so it was north, it was right or flipped or reversed. So anyway, in about 150 or so, what would that be, 150 bytes maybe, I stored thousands of combinations there, and I don't know that anybody ever caught on, but I was proud of the hack. I thought it was a cool hack on my part. I don't know that anybody ever noticed or cared, but it was something else. And oddly enough, 20 years later, or so, 15 years later, I ended up using the same technology during the .com boom. There was a company in Seattle here that was looking for a VP of technology, and they called me in. They said, we want to create this web app that, well, it wasn't an app then, it was a website, of course. This was 1999. That would enable people to make appointments. Well, so if you're going to make an appointment, you need to know what times of day you can schedule. And so we said, well, how can we do that? And they had a database manager person who was used to dealing with huge databases, and the response was, well, we'll just feed every long list of every time that's available. So if there's a time slot from 12:15 to 12:30, we'll send 1, 2, 1, 5, and then 1, 2, 3, 0, and then you'll know that so that would be 9 bytes for one time slot, and this was the time of 1200 baud modems, and it was not. You couldn't really transfer that much data. So I started thinking about it, and I said, well, what if we assigned every 5 minutes to be a bit, and there would be 12 bits in an hour. So you could signal, if you had from 12:15 to 12:30 open, you would have the first 3 or 4 bits toggled, and then the 12:30, the one for 12:15, the one for 12:20, and the 12 would be untoggled. They would be zeros. So in a matter of 1 byte, you could, I think it got down to, when you do the math, it was just a little over 1 kilobyte. I could tell you an entire month's availability of calendar.
Wow.
Yeah,
that's pretty wild.
And oh my gosh, it was. But it was all came back from being able to program dots and dashes on Donald Duck's playground and
I love it.
bits of maze and Patty.
Solving a real life puzzle with adventure game logic. That's brilliant.
Exactly.
Well, I've got one more question for you, and then we'll hand it over to Rick for the mailbag so you can get on with your day. I was wondering if you could give us one behind-the-scenes story that stands out to you as particularly humorous or endearing or whatever from your time at Sierra.
Well, gosh, no. God, I can't give you one. I mean, there were thousands of, weird, funny, odd things that happened.
Perhaps you could just quickly write a novel for me.
I can tell you one really interesting thing that happened because of Larry. And because of gaming, and I don't know that I've shared this story particularly, but when Larry was ready to ship, I had used his last name a few times in the game, and I had used the name of a guy who worked at Sierra. His name wasn't Larry, but I used his last name, and it was kind of an inside joke because he was kind of Larry-ish. And so, it was funny to all of us, and it wouldn't hurt anybody else. Well, just before the game shipped, John Williams called me and said, Al, you better change that guy's name because he quit the company this morning, and I'm afraid he might sue us, and blah, blah, blah. And I was like, oh, shit, okay. So what am I going to do for a last name? Well, Land of the Lounge Lizards was the title of the game. And I thought, oh, maybe Larry should have an alliterative last name as well. So my wife and I had just bought an Encyclopedia Britannica. Remember those things? They were called books. So I grabbed volume L out of the Encyclopedia Britannica, and I started paging through from the very beginning. And one of the first images I saw was a photograph. Actually, it was a woodcut line drawing of Arthur B. Laffer. Huh. Now, I'm sure your listeners aren't familiar with the name Arthur B. Laffer, but in the early 80s, he was a big deal because he convinced President Reagan, that trickle-down economics was a great idea. He invented a thing called the Laffer curve, which said if you give rich people lots of money, they'll spend it on poor people, which I think we've all have demonstrated over the years to be a big mistake. But at the time, Arthur B. Laffer was a huge economist. He went around the world teaching people how to run banks and how to run their country's currencies and things. I mean, he was a big deal. And I thought, what better name for a comic character than Laffer? It sounds like laughter. It sounds like, And so that's how Larry got his last name, was because of Arthur B. Laffer. So in about 1990 or so, we had a idea for a project that wasn't an adventure game, but it was rather a collection of utility programs that you could use just for fun, just funny stuff. But instead of it being helpful and useful, it'll be ways to screw around at the office. And remember, a lot of our customers were office people because they didn't have home computers. So the guys in marketing said, what can we do to do this? And somebody said, well, Arthur B. Laffer was big on productivity, and he's an economist. Perhaps he would write us an insult non-endorsement. And then we could put his picture on the box and okay. So they called Laffer's office and said, this is John Williams from Sierra Online, and we have this new product that we're putting out, and we'd like you to write an insult about it. And if you don't have anything, we can write insults for you, and you can pick one. And his secretary said, "Okay, well, I'll tell him." So I learned the story later. She went into him, and he said, What's a home computer? Who has a computer in their house? And wait, why would you? No, why? Who would want? No, I don't. What's a Sierra? What? And her son had played Leisure Suit Larry, and she said, "Sir, I think you should look at this because I think there's something here. My son's friends, and he loved these games, and I think this is an up-and-coming business." And well, he was also an investor, and he liked to get in, early on and do angel investing. And so he called back and said, "Yeah, I'll come take a look." So he flew up to Fresno and wanted to take a tour of the company and so forth. Well, Ken Williams was busy with something else that day, and I had just bought a new Lexus. And so I lived in Fresno by the airport. So he said, "Al, would you mind picking him up and driving him around for a day?" And I said, "Sure, yeah, I'll do that." So I spent a day with Arthur B. Laffer, this guy who was who helped ruin our economy, and took him around and to see if he wanted to invest in Sierra. And sure enough, he chose not to, and he could have made a hell of a lot of money, but he didn't. And anyway, that's the Arthur B. Laffer story.
That's great. Well, I think Rick, you have a few extra questions from some people in the Classic Gamers Guild.
Yeah, so there's the so obviously a lot of people in the Classic Gamers Guild are big fans of yours, so I put it out there that they can ask you some questions via our mailbag. I got a few here. We'll see if we can get through some of these, but they're just sort of short form questions here. The first one is from Daniel Kennerly Rowe. Is there a joke that you tried to put into a Leisure Suit Larry game that was so lewd and crude it got 86'd by the higher-ups?
No.
Really?
Because before I put questionable content in my games, I ran it by my wife first.
Oh.
Smart man.
So I say, "Margaret, what do you think about?" And if she went, "Oh my God," then I would not put it in. and if she said, "Oh, I don't know," and then I would put it in.
All right. This one comes from Nalani Briscoe. I know Torin's Passage was supposed to have a sequel. What was the story plot going to be for that?
Well, I originally, let's see, Torin's Passage was designed specifically because Ken Williams wanted a product that was family-oriented for the years when there was no King's Quest. At first, games were about a year. It took about a year to develop, and then King's Quest took about 2 years to develop. And so Ken wanted a game for the Christmases without a King's Quest. And he said, "Can you do that?" And I said, that would be fun instead of doing the adult titles like I've been doing, to do something that would be playable by a family. And that was about the same time that I went to see Mrs. Doubtfire. And so I noticed during Mrs. Doubtfire that there were two pitches of laughter that when Robin Williams would do something, really silly and slapstick, there would be this yee from all the kids in the audience, this high-pitched little laughter. And then whenever he would say some really dirty double entendre that they didn't get, there would be all this from the adults in the audience. And I thought, why aren't there games like that? Why aren't there games where an adult could play with a kid and, the adult would get a lot of the jokes, but there'd be things that the kid would also laugh at that and anyway, so I wanted to, I said, well, let me create a game that had 2 levels of comedy, that had a real slapstick thing that even little kids could enjoy, and maybe a higher plane of humor that for the adults. And that's how Torin's Passage came about. So when Ken said to do this, I said, well, I knew that King's Quest was sequels, and he had talked about, doing a series of these every other year. And so I planned out 5 games. I plotted this kid's life from being raised as an orphan child to becoming prince, earning the kingdom, and eventually have a challenge to his authority, and growing old and dying. And literally I had a 5-game storyline plotted out in my head. And I wrote the game with the full intention that part 2 would be coming out soon, and I didn't have to explain everything that was in part 1. But I didn't take into account the fact that the game market changed horribly when Sierra was taken over by criminals. And, the company was stolen from Ken in a hostile takeover. These guys that are now that ended up going to federal penitentiary, stole the company and ruined it. Obviously, I didn't know any of that at the time, or I would have made the plot line more clear to Torin's Passage. I also would have sold off a lot of my investment in the company had I known. But that was a sad period in this art. But anyway, the Torin eventually was going to have a challenge to his authority, become king, and have a challenge, and grow old and die during the course of 5 games.
Mm-hmm. All right. This next question is from Martin Van Grinsven.
No, not Martin.
Oh, yes, Martin. What Larry game is your favorite, and what non-Larry adventure game is your favorite?
Well, Larry 7 is my favorite. I think primarily because by the time I got to Larry 7, I felt like I finally knew how to write an adventure game. Before that, I was experimenting and trying to figure things out, and hoping nobody would notice that I had no clue what the hell I was doing. And but by the time I got to Larry 7, I thought, I know how to do this now. And I also had a wonderful team. They all had experience. And they were all, the programmers were better programmers than I was. The musician was great. The composer was a noted jazz artist, and just everything about the game was just at a level that I was very proud of. So it was. It would have to be Larry 7. I think my favorite other game probably would be Loom.
Good one.
Which is an old game, but I'll tell you what, if you haven't played it, you could do far worse than to dig up a copy someplace. I don't know, where is it? Is it available someplace?
Oh yeah, it's available on GOG and Steam.
Yeah, I would think so.
Pretty easy now.
Yeah. But what a great game, and partly that's because I'm a musician. I have a soft spot in my heart for that story. But
all right, so the next question is from Christian Surer. I'm probably mispronouncing that, but there you go. What do you think of the latest Leisure Suit Larry game, Wet Dreams Don't Dry, made by a German team? And do you think it captures the spirit of the originals?
I love their intentions. I thought they had the right intentions. I thought they had a terribly difficult project, a difficult goal, because what they wanted to do was to do a Larry kind of game in the current climate. And Larry was a product of its time. You know, he was of the 80s. I mean, well, he was of the 70s. But I mean, you know, the story and the game itself was timely. and to bring that into the current time. I didn't even try. When we did Leisure Suit Larry Reloaded in, what was that, 2013? I'm thinking?
Yeah.
2012. We didn't even try. We said, nope, it's going to be set in the 80s. He's going to stay in the 80s, and we'll have some, inside jokes about things that'll happen in the future, maybe, or something, but we didn't even try to bring him up to date. They tried to bring him up to date, and their method was to have him be in a time capsule and come out, and now he's a guy in the teens who's of the 70s. Right. And man, that's a long stretch, So they had a huge challenge, but I thought it came pretty close, What I really wished was when they asked me to endorse the game, and I chose not to because when I played it, the more I played it, the more I thought, oh my God, this could be so much better. We could do so much more. And I said, I'll tell you what, if you have time, I will help you. I'll consult on it, but I don't think I can endorse it per se. And they chose not to, so that's the way it goes. But I think their premise was good, and I thought they came the closest of the three post me period. Is that a phrase?
And last question here is from Ryan Levitt. If you could go back and change one thing about the early games of the series, what would you change and why?
Oh, well, I was always unhappy with Larry 1 because I didn't create the puzzles. Ken had a huge selling game back in the early 80s called Softporn. It was the only game that Sierra published that had no graphics, and it was a huge hit. So when he asked me to do an update to it, I looked at it and said, oh, man, this game is so out of touch. It doesn't have a protagonist. It doesn't have any sorts of clues particularly. It's a really difficult game to figure out. It talks about you in a strange sense. Instead of having Larry do things on screen, the game would say, I am your puppet master. I will do whatever thee demands. Stuff like that. It was like, So I threw away all the text, but I kept the scenes. I kept the setting and the puzzles. And there were some puzzles that I just really wished that I had not kept and come up with something better instead. There were some obscure puzzles that were pretty difficult, but once they were in, I kept them in. So
this is actually one not from the mailbag. It's just something that popped into my head because it's a question I've been having for a little bit. So the famous picture of Eve from Leisure Suit Larry 1, which is the final woman that Larry finally manages to seduce, sitting in the hot tub there. Very strikingly similar pose as Roberta Williams, who is posing in the Soft Porn Adventures cover. So is it fair to say that Eve is Roberta Williams?
No, but it's fair to say that Mark Crow used whatever images he could come up with. No, I think Mark did an amazing job to, particularly for the limited amount of color. Remember, we only had 16 colors.
Oh, yeah.
For the limited colors and the resolution, I think it was really light. It was very low resolution, and I thought he did a tremendous job coming up with those.
Oh yeah, the graphics from that era, the AGI era, are actually I think just like the most striking. Like in my opinion, like a lot of the most beautiful. Like a lot of the graphics and scenery in Police Quest were fantastic, and Leisure Suit Larry, the portraits of the women are just there's just something about that particular style that just even as graphics got technically better, just didn't really capture quite the same look and feel.
It's that damn uncanny valley.
Yeah.
You know, the closer we get, the farther away it looks.
Absolutely.
You know, it just gets creepier at some point. You know,
It does. Yeah.
So I think that's one reason anime is so popular. You know.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I think that's all the time we have.
What? It's only been 5 minutes.
I think it's only fair to let you go. I know you've got to go dig up them Larry 4 discs that you lost somewhere. So we'll let you get on with that. But make we talked about the Laffer utilities. Very few people know that game, the Laffer utilities. The title was the Laffer Utilities version 4.0. That was my Larry 4
That
joke.
was Larry 4.
Well, it wasn't
Not
really,
but it was. Yeah.
but I thought that was funny to add that to the
Yeah.
Oh, that's great. That's like learning the secret of Monkey Island at the end of the episode here. We finally understand.
Well, can we just
42.
consider it Leisure Suit Larry 4 just because everyone's been wanting to put that to rest?
Yeah, that would be fine. You know, Larry 4 was going. Well, we're wrapping. I shouldn't start.
Oh no, we have time for one more.
Well, Larry 4 was going to be an interactive multiplayer adventure game.
Oh man.
Oh, wow.
Ken had this idea. Oh gosh, he had his mother or grandma. I think his grandmother liked to play bridge. And play games, and he wanted to have a way that she could play games online with other people. And so he came up with this whole Sierra network, it became. It originally started out as Constant Companion. So it was any time of the day or night you could go online and find somebody else to play games with. Multiplayer games. And so in that mold, he said, well, why don't you do an adventure game that is multiplayer? Now, this was 1989, 90, maybe 1990. And what we envisioned, what we wanted to do was essentially like Ultima Online. But we were 10 years too early. I mean, we just couldn't do it with 1,200 baud modems and the limited processor speeds that we had, and we didn't even we didn't know that there was an internet. This was before the web, of course, but there was an internet back then. But we ended up programming all those games to be answered by a computer with multiple modems inside it, and we had multiple phone lines brought into the building, and so we didn't even know there were X25 lines and stuff. It was incredibly primitive. So anyway, that was Larry 4 was going to be a multiplayer universe game, and of course we were 10 years too early.
Oh, goodness.
Wow.
That sounds like it would have been amazing. It sounds like we traded a multiplayer Larry for a random lunch generator.
Exactly.
Well, that's great. Well, mate, you're an absolute legend. You're a hero of mine, and I just want to thank you so much for taking all this time to be with us.
Well, you're certainly welcome. And if anybody is still awake, which I find hard to believe, if you stayed around this long, you should go to my website, allowe.com. And I have lots and lots of information about Sierra in the old days, and funny stories and inside stories of things that happened back then. And also a heck of a lot of humor, a lot of ways to laugh, including a joke database. If you ever need a joke for a special occasion or something, you can do a search, just like a Google search, except searching through all the, I think, 7,000 jokes that I have in there. So anyways, drop by allowe.com and follow me on Twitter. I'm Al Lowe, one word, 6 letters. And every weekday morning, I'll send you 2 jokes, one of which is clean.
Well, Oh, that's mint. Yes, everyone, go check out Lowe's humor site. Sign up at you can get your Cyber Joke 3000, I believe it's called. I love
Cyber Joke 3000.
There's your soundbite, and everyone out there listening, you can find us on Facebook, the Classic Gamers Guild. We're a page, we're a group. We're on Instagram at CGGG, a bunch of C's and G's podcast. We're on Twitter. Do us a bloody tweet. Yeah. Do us a tweeter. I sound like Frankenstein's assistant. A tweeter. Do us a tweet, right, at the CG Guild. We're on Patreon. Oh, a special thank you to our extra special thanks tier Patreon supporters, Jay Holmes and Mark Fillion. We love you all. Thank you for listening, and don't do a murder.
A collection of crows?
I guess.
What advice do you have for us, Al?
Don't collect crows. That would be.